Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this important webinar on the somber occasion of Transgender Day of Remembrance. My name is Rodrigo Heng-Lehtinen, or Rigo for short. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the executive director of the National Center for Transgender Equality. And so honored to be with you all here today. Thank you for taking the time, and really honored to be partnering with Everytown on this important initiative. Angela, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Rodrigo. And thank you all for joining in what I think will be an impactful conversation. In addition to the important partnership between our two organizations, I'm just really grateful to be sharing space with you, Rodrigo, and everyone else joining us virtually on this year's Trans Day of Remembrance. My name is Angela Ferrell-Zabala, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a wife and mom of four, and the executive director of Moms Demand Action, the largest grassroots movement of Americans fighting for common sense gun safety measures that we know will keep our communities safe, and policies that American people have also made overwhelmingly clear that they want enacted. So before we get started, as we hold space to remember all the trans lives that have been taken and lost, I want to acknowledge the lives that were affected by the shooting last year at Club Q in Colorado Springs. Club Q is a devastating reminder that gun violence impacts everyone, but the combination of easy access to firearms and hate makes this crisis especially deadly for LGBTQ+ Americans.
Absolutely. And, Transgender Day of Remembrance is such a somber day when transgender communities and really just anyone who loves and supports us around the world mourn the loss that gets heavier every year. But conversations like this are so critical to have because at the core of this violence is a cultural misunderstanding about who transgender people even are and the legitimacy of our lives. That becomes fertile ground for dehumanizing us as a community. Unless we can name that unfamiliarity with who trans people are and begin to address it, we will never be able to bring an end to the epidemic of violence that arose out of that. So with that, to dive in, I have a question for you, Angela. What does your reporting at Everytown find about how gun violence specifically affects the transgender community?
Well, thanks for the question. I want to further expand on this shortly, but I think it's first important to highlight that there are so many gaps when it comes to collecting data around gun violence affecting the trans community, and that these gaps make it so difficult to understand the true extent of the crisis and most effective ways to solve it. Number two, easy access to firearms make it way too easy for folks with extremist views to commit harm against marginalized communities. And finally, when we combine that issue of easy access to firearms with an environment saturated with anti-trans sentiment, our trans siblings can't live and thrive, with suicide being a result. So we have to include our country's gun violence epidemic when we're having this discussion about violence against the trans community.
Yeah, I especially appreciate you bringing up suicide with the easy access to firearms, because that's something that NCTE has been increasingly looking at. And I know we'll talk about a little later in this webinar about what that means for our analysis for Trans Day of Remembrance, especially. But before we get there, can you share a couple more takeaways of what this data, the data that we do have, is showing us? How do we interpret this?
Well, I can say that in the past several years, we've seen trans homicide rise, and we're currently holding steady when we look at the trends. And out of trans homicides that have taken place this year, 75% were committed with firearms. Again, this is what makes it even more deadly, is that easy access to guns. And most of these trans homicides were perpetrated against Black trans women.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, at NCTE, we've been having to really grapple with how the rates of violence against transgender people are rising when otherwise hate crimes are actually starting to decline. So this is very much out of step with what is otherwise happening nationally, which really is, we think, a combination of that easy access to firearms and also the anti-transgender rhetoric and hostility that when society sends a message that it's okay to question a transgender person's legitimacy, and when elected officials, people who are supposed to be leaders of our nation, go out and spout anti-trans hatred, combine that with the easy access, and really that hatred now gets weaponized.
That's absolutely right. Well, are you okay if I ask you some questions?
Sure.
Great. So it's so important to talk about the numbers and the data here, but we can't forget that these are real people we're talking about. And behind these numbers were people who lived, who had loved ones, who had hopes and dreams. Is there one story of someone you lost or you know of that you want to share?
Yeah, and it's really tough because each person in our report is so important within their own communities, and this project isn't just about any one person, but at the same time it kind of is, because like you're saying, every individual here had a life and a story and people who cared about them, and that often gets lost in the reporting, even in what is generally the best case scenario, which is that the media reports on this violence, because largely the media ignores it. But even in
Yeah.
the best case scenario where they do pay attention to it, it really still falls flat as almost like just a data point instead of a full three-dimensional person. So that's one of the things we were really trying to remedy with NCTE's Trans Remembrance Report, to show the people behind the numbers. And one story that comes to mind is London Price. She was a Black transgender woman living in Miami, my hometown. So this felt literally close to home. And her life was cut short by an ex-boyfriend. So this was someone who, had claimed to have loved her once upon a time. And on top of it, her family knew him, and they long suspected a tendency toward violence. And they even witnessed this brutal and tragic ordeal. And yet the police didn't even take action quickly. And it's worth noting that this was in Florida, which has an abundance of anti-transgender legislation and administrative actions. There's been a whole environment, a policy environment saturated with anti-trans hostility in Florida. And it's not a coincidence that then we saw this uptick of violence there. That rhetoric and that policy making dehumanizes trans people, and that in turn fuels acts of violence against our community. And that disproportionately victimizes transgender women specifically, or trans feminine people of color.
Well, thanks for sharing that. So important that we constantly are raising these stories. So as you and the NCTE team are looking over the available data and reading the list stories of how we're losing our trans siblings, what patterns are you seeing and what's the comparison to last year, if any?
Well, first off, I'll echo what you said earlier about the difficulty of collecting data on these issues. So the numbers that I'll share through today are likely conservative in the sense that they're really, any number is really just at least, it is a minimum. It's quite possible that there's even more of this violence out there than goes reported. Transgender people are more likely to be, who are victims of violence, are more likely to be misidentified by law enforcement, or by journalists, or even unsupportive families. So what that means is that when a transgender person is killed or otherwise passes away, often the authorities who are investigating them don't realize that they were transgender, or their own families will refer to them by the wrong name and the wrong pronouns because they had rejected this person for being transgender. So that makes it hard to really capture accurate information for our community.
So
But
many layers there, so many layers.
yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't realize how difficult it is to even do something as simple as update your driver's license or your state ID. If you want to change the name or the gender marker on there to accurately reflect how you live every day, it is quite expensive. It can actually be against policy depending on where you live. So simple things like just looking at the victim's driver's license to determine who they are is actually really fraught and complex.
Well, this is
But
why these conversations are so important to have. So people are aware, especially those that are, this is not their lived experience, understand what this means. Because, right now we hear a lot of rhetoric and people don't pay attention. And I think these stories are so important to lift up. And so I really commend you all for releasing these stories in this report.
yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And we really appreciate the partnership with Everytown, because in order to paint some accurate picture here, it takes all of us who have any kind of research mechanism or any kind of tracking and policy expertise. All of us have to come to the table and almost put together like a puzzle. It takes all of that in order to get a complete picture. And we did see from what we're able to gather that at least 53 transgender people were died by fatal violence this year. So that's the highest we've ever encountered. Of those 53, the transgender women were still overrepresented in this year's data. So 36 out of the at least 53 were trans women specifically. And even within that, 21 of them were Black transgender women. So Black transgender women are essentially half of the overall number of people whose lives were lost to violence this year. And that, of course, is completely out of step with the general demographics of this country, which really shows this is a combination of transphobia and racism and trans misogyny all coming to a head.
That's right. Well, thank you for sharing that. Again, important data for people to understand. Before we move to another question, can you make it plain to those watching, why is it important to keep this list? I think you said some of it, but really digging into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, if we're going to change this, if we're going to turn the tide of violence back, we need to understand the true scope of the problem. We need this data to ensure that then we can advocate with law enforcement to investigate cases more sensitively. We can advocate with policymakers to come up with some common sense solutions that would help people. And elected officials. I mean, we cannot influence any of these stakeholders and actually improve people's lives unless we understand the scope of the problem that we're dealing with. And also for a lot of our community, this is unfortunately and tragically the only place where they can be remembered. So many transgender people, we are still being kicked out of our homes and rejected by our families. And so, and also rejected oftentimes by our places of worship, whether churches or mosques or synagogues. So the places where our dead are often remembered as a culture are the exact places where transgender people are often excluded. So these kinds of reports that NCTE brings forward are often the only place where we can celebrate someone we've lost for their authentic selves.
Wow. Thank you, Rodrigo, for lifting that up for us.
Of course. And you know, another question to turn back to you is, what patterns or causation is Everytown seeing with violence against the trans community? I mean, at NCT, we're coming at this from this trans perspective, but you all have this comprehensive view of gun violence more broadly. What are the patterns that you're seeing?
Yeah, so you and those who are watching this know that the past few years in particular have been devastating when it comes to anti-trans rhetoric. There are currently around 420 anti-trans bills being proposed in state legislatures across the country, especially in red states. And parallel to this are the bad gun laws being proposed in those same state legislatures. This makes it incredibly hard to live and thrive as a trans person. Our gun violence crisis is not an inevitability. We have the tools to solve it. That's what makes it so frustrating. But when we look at what's happening in state legislatures, it should come as no surprise that when we see anti-trans homicides or hate-motivated mass shootings in queer spaces, it should come as no surprise when we've also lost many of our trans siblings due to suicide, with firearms as the most common method for this. So when we're talking about gun violence and the trans community, it's important to talk about the access to firearms. We got to see both of these things together in order to think about the solutions. And like I said, not inevitability, but what are we going to do to help prevent this and make it also make more people aware of how dangerous this is, this combination between the anti-trans rhetoric and easy access to firearms is very deadly, and we have our all eyes on, and that's why we're excited to be partnering closely with you and other frontline organizations doing this incredibly important work.
Yeah, that is absolutely critical. This is such a widespread phenomenon. It is not only one state or one place. Tragically enough, it's so essential to have that full analysis. I mean, we've talked already some about data and the difficulty of gathering data on these topics. Is there anything else you would add about the struggles to gather this?
So we have to recognize here that the gaps when it comes to reporting on violence against trans people, whether that's law enforcement, misgendering, or dead naming trans victims, or the reporting system on the definition of what constitutes as a hate crime, all that we have to look at. As a result, the number that gets reported out to the public isn't accurate and very well, and doesn't, fully articulate what we're seeing. And it might be lower than the actual amount of trans lives that have been lost or stolen from us. So the lives of so many of our trans siblings go unacknowledged. And there's so much more work that we need to do there in terms of how Everytown collects data and information. We work with partners like NCTE and HRC to get information about those that we've lost and verify information about their deaths through available law enforcement and court databases. Again, out of the 28 trans homicides that have taken place this year, 21 of those were committed with the use of a firearm. So we're doing everything we can to make sure we are comparing data and getting the most accurate picture, knowing that there is some miscalculation because there's some underreporting that's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can seem kind of nerdy to focus so much on data collection, but
so important, right?
Right? I mean, it's the bedrock. Yeah.
It's how we get our resources. It's how we can make clear and strategies that are absolutely doing the things that we need to protect our communities. Without it, we're kind of like, in the dark and trying to kind of create solutions. So it's so important. And we're going to continue to do that as you all are. I do have a question for you, if I can shift it for you. So as we're talking about gaps in the data collecting and violence against our trans siblings, how can we prevent these things from happening in the first place?
Well, yeah, prevention is so key here because we have to start getting ahead of this problem. We cannot let the tide keep turning against our community like this. So now, first of all, like we talked about data collection, understanding the epidemic is the first step. Like any disease, you can't jump to treatment. You have to understand it first, but we can't stop there. So what we also need to do is to pivot from that awareness to action. And one thing is really fighting the dehumanizing rhetoric and misinformation. This violence is underpinned by a climate that makes it okay to call transgender people into question simply because we happen to be transgender. I mean, that is what sends the message that you can attack a trans person and frankly, maybe even get away with it. So we have to really educate the public on what it means to be transgender, and that a lot of these myths about us are just that. They are lies. They are not accurate. We also have to push back against the legislative attacks against transgender people. So even something that may not look like it's violence prevention, like fighting for greater healthcare access, is still essential. We've seen from 2020 to now in 2023, we've seen the record being broken every single year for the number of anti-transgender bills introduced. So that's in state legislatures all around the country, red states, blue states, truly universal in the United States of America. We are seeing more and more anti-transgender bills introduced in state houses and state senates. And again, that sends the message that we are not the same kind of legitimate American as our neighbors. What we need to then, what that calls us, I think, to do is that kind of bread and butter democracy stuff of calling your senator, signing up for lobby days, voting if you're eligible to vote. That may not seem like the sexiest thing in the world, but those are the things that show elected officials that you support your transgender neighbors and that those anti-transgender views are a losing ticket, and that instead they need to start supporting us.
That's right.
And I do, want to, as we're talking about kind of policy interventions here, want to expand on that more. From Everytown side, what are some of your thoughts on what else can be done in policy to prevent these shootings? And also especially the new Office of Gun Violence coming out of the White House and the Department of Justice LGBTQI+ working group. What should they be focusing on?
Well, we're always looking at how we can focus, retool, recalibrate all options to end this public health crisis. But it's been really great having a consistent ally in the current administration. We love them because they understand and they're committed to stopping gun violence, especially with the creation, as you mentioned, the White House Office for Gun Violence Prevention. And so I think this shows that the Biden-Harris administration is doubling down on being the strongest gun safety administration in our history. and they're trying to use every single tool at their disposal to save lives. So as we've been talking about throughout our conversation, the past few years, especially under the last administration, haven't been welcoming to trans people. But I think that the Biden-Harris administration has proven to be the most inclusive administration when it comes to the trans community, whether that's the appointment of openly trans folks like Admiral Rachel Levine as the Assistant Secretary for HHS, or taking executive action to protect the LGBTQ communities that includes provisions for our trans siblings, or the creation of the DOJ's LGBTQ plus working group. So even though we've made huge strides, we know that we definitely have much more work to do where violence against trans siblings is concerned. And so it's important to talk about access to firearms here. And we want to see them take action towards closing those gun seller loopholes, like online sales or gun show sales. Sorry, I'm getting so tongue-tied. I'm excited. But closing those loopholes so that there's more of a vetting process so authorities can weed out those who seek to commit hate-motivated violence, that they don't have access to firearms, passing red flag laws to keep guns out of the hands of those who could harm themselves or others, and securely storing firearms away if you do have one in your home or a place where you have loved ones, to make sure that that's securely stored. So we're looking at all options. And those are just a few examples. There's many, many more. But again, we're really thrilled to be working with this administration because they've been a very strong partner, and they understand that this is a public health crisis that requires all hands on deck. So I'd love to hear from you what Everytown's policy recommendations that I read out to you, like, what would be the most helpful for trans community? Or maybe there's something I didn't say that you think would be really helpful when it comes to preventing and curbing violence in the trans community.
Definitely. Well, we also at NCTE support a lot of these common sense gun safety measures. I mean, 100% we need universal background checks and the prohibition of sales of assault weapons, bump stocks, high capacity magazines, all of these things that make it okay for not just someone to like weaponize their hatred really aggressively. Any of these measures that make it very easy to hurt not just one person, but dozens of people, that is a public safety threat to all of us, and in particular to transgender people, as it's a threat to anyone who is from a particularly marginalized community. I mean, unfortunately, in this country, we've seen rising attacks against transgender people. And like you mentioned, Club Q, these queer spaces, LGBTQ spaces. But we've also seen attacks on religious minorities and all sorts of different groups of people who are stigmatized or, targeted in any way. So we need to get these assault weapons and these high capacity magazines off the streets. They shouldn't be available for sale. And we need those universal background checks so that we're closing these loopholes that keep guns out the hands keep making them so readily available that someone could just arm their hatred that quickly.
That's right. And you said it so perfectly, giving people the ability to weaponize hate. I'm going to use that, so you might hear it again. I got a few questions, so I'm just going to say them all. But I want to first know, like, how can we help to activate our communities for those policy changes that you mentioned and some of that I mentioned? Also, can you talk a little bit about what the U.S. Trans Survey is? And then, I told you I have several questions. And then what are the challenges with the survey and getting info on trans violence?
Love those questions. Well, first of all, so I'll take actually the second one first about the USTS, the U.S. Transgender Survey. That is our research that we conduct here at NCTE, and it is the largest and most comprehensive study of transgender people's experiences in the United States. I mean, it's kind of surprising. We're a policy shop, so you wouldn't really think we'd be out there conducting research. But we had to take matters in our own hands because there just simply wasn't numbers out there. And so, you can't solve a problem that you can't even prove exists, right? So we started doing this USTS, U.S. Transgender Survey, in 2011. We just actually completed a cycle of it last December. And so we're right on the brink, almost there to release our survey findings. So we'll have a new crop soon. But it's really essential because it is the only way that we get our finger really on the pulse of what is happening for trans people on the ground in all 50 states, in all US territories, places big and small, urban, rural, suburban. The full breadth of our community is captured here. And
That's
that
right.
and that really,
Town, right? Every single town, every place, every person. That's right.
right? I mean, people think that transgender people just live in New York and San Francisco or something. But the truth is, we are statistically just as likely to live in the South, live in the Midwest, live in rural areas as any other American. That is, we have compared our survey responses to the US Census. 14% of people in the US Census live in rural areas. 14% of US transgender survey respondents live in rural areas. I mean, we are everywhere.
Yes.
And that really informs then our policy work. And to your question of how can we activate folks to get involved? I mean, it's really what we said earlier of the bread and butter advocacy. We do not need to reinvent the wheel here. This is about contacting your lawmakers. This is about showing up to vote. If you are eligible to vote, then when you go out and vote, bring 2 friends with you. Make a date out of it. Go to brunch afterwards. Make it a party. It's all of these, and also educate your neighbors. A lot of people still don't really understand what it means to be transgender. And because they're not familiar with our issues, they fall for misinformation, not because they actually have hatred in their hearts against trans people, but simply because they don't know any better. They don't, we're a very small community. We're maybe 1% of the population. So it's kind of understandable. Most people don't think they know one of us. But if you are educated on transgender issues, then you can educate your neighbors. And if you hear someone saying something that is inaccurate, it's your opportunity to let them know what the truth really is. And I am confident that when we give the truth the chance to compete like that, people come to our side. Most people want to support their neighbors. They just need the accurate information to do so.
Yeah, that's very important. And I love that you raised the education piece. And I just want to lay in there and say it also shouldn't be all on the shoulders of trans people to have to educate about trans community. I think it's important, but I also think it takes everyone else to be able to, if you see something, say something. And if you don't have the information, find it. But I think if we're all able to kind of speak on this and kind of push back rhetoric that is hateful and untrue, then we are helping to, like you said, disarm mentally and move people away from their fear, which contributes in many cases to violence to trans communities. So thank you for that. Thank you so much. I do have a question. This is going to be my last question. Are you ready for it?
Ready for it.
All right. So where are our organizations' opportunities for fighting together? I'm always about coalition building and having a united front, because it's going to take all of us to get to the other side of all of these issues. And by the way, opposition is usually similar. So I'm fighting for gun violence prevention in this country, and you're fighting to make sure that trans people are treated and they can thrive and survive in this country without being treated like they're not humans, basically, and not have this terrible rhetoric and ways that they can't in spaces. So how do we as organizations are the opportunities for fighting together?
Yeah, this is such a key question. I mean, like you said, the opposition is usually quite coordinated, and they are really connecting the dots between all these issues. So we really have to as well. Intersectionality is not just a buzzword, that is a lived reality, especially for the Black transgender women who are disproportionately targeted by the anti-trans violence. So our opportunities for fighting together, well, I'll note that of the at least 53 community members we're mourning this year on Transgender Remembrance, 30 of those, their death was the result of a shooting with firearms in particular. Again, that's 30 out of at least 53. That is shocking. And then it's just firearms. So I think that paints a very clear picture about the intersection between the movement to end violence against trans people and the movement for gun safety and responsible firearms ownership. It is not a huge leap to imagine that if our country was not grappling with this parallel epidemic of gun violence, we would be mourning fewer community members lost on Transgender Day of Remembrance. These are absolutely interconnected fights, and they need interconnected solutions. So I think there's really rich opportunity for organizations to continue working together, for everyone who supports transgender people and everyone who supports common sense gun safety reform to come together. That is how we can protect more people.
That's right. Said very well.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me today. It is so incredibly working together. This is a tragic day, but I am heartened by more and more non-trans organizations really understanding this intersection and taking it seriously. So just personally, I'm very grateful to you, Angela, and to Everytown for support on this.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The same goes back to you. Thank you for everything that you're doing, and know that you have allies with us, and we're here in the fight with you, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that all of our communities are safe, that they don't have to live in fear for their lives, whether it's being targeted because of your identity or feeling unsafe because there is just a culture of guns in this country, where it's a guns everywhere agenda, it feels like, from our the gun lobby and the extreme right. So we are here with you, and happy and honored to do this. And thank you so much for having space with me today.
So appreciate it. And thank you, everyone tuning in from home, marking this occasion with us and joining the activist fight. Appreciate you all.